All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for Armchair Travel to Scotland. Visit Scotland's two biggest cities. Edinburgh is royal and stately, while Glasgow is brash and edgy. But both have rich history, amazing museums, and incredible architecture. And there is always time to stop at a pub for a pint and some fish and chips. You're talking my language, Jeff. So tonight's program is led by the traveling librarian, Jeff Klapes, who's the retired head of reference services at the Beebe Memorial Library in Wakefield. And he is an avid traveler and photographer. And I think we've hosted him at least a dozen times, and we've co-hosted him with other libraries probably another dozen times or so. He's one of my favorite speakers. So let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jeff for joining us here tonight. And Jeff, you can take it away. Thanks so
Thank,
much.
thanks so much, Robert, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started right away. Uh, Share. There we go. Hope that looks there. Okay, that looks okay. Welcome for those of you who thank you to those of many of you who have been to so many of my programs. I feel like I'm almost on the staff at the Tewksbury Public Library because I've done so many programs for them. But I love being invited back. And if this is your first time to one of my programs, I hope you enjoy it. We are going to see basically, we're going to focus on the two main cities of Scotland tonight. This is a trip that I did just last month, actually. Is that true? No, November. I take it back. November, 2 months ago. And you may be surprised to know that for someone like me who has done so much traveling, I've never actually been to Scotland. It's been on my list for a long time. And there was a cheap fare. And so I decided I would go and just at least spend a week or so seeing, if not the surrounding countryside, because November isn't really the best time to do that in Scotland, but I really wanted to see the two main cities, Edinburgh, the capital, and Glasgow. So I'm going to start. As Robert said, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the Q&A, and I'll see if I can keep an eye on those as we go along and answer them along the way. And if I miss any when the program's over, I'll try and catch up. It's funny because despite a horribly rainy forecast, which is not unusual for Scotland at this time of year in November, I had 8 days of completely beautiful, clear, sunny, and reasonably warm for November weather, which is very uncharacteristic. And you can see here, this is flying into Glasgow Airport over some of the scenery in the west of Scotland. In fact, we got a beautiful view of Loch Lomond, which you can see over on the right. Putting Scotland on the map, just a little basic information. It's about 5.5 million people, so slightly smaller than Massachusetts, which I think is edging up closer to 8 million at this point. And it's funny because if you look at the map and see the size of Scotland compared to the size of England, England's population is 10 times as large as that of Scotland. And even Massachusetts, which is roughly the same geographic area, has like 2 million more people. The two cities that we're going to look at tonight, Edinburgh, which is the capital, has about 500,000 people. Glasgow is slightly bigger, around 600 or so. But roughly, they're both about the size of Boston, for those of you in Massachusetts. Of course, I'm sure if you've followed the news, you know that Scotland, being part of the UK, is no longer in the European Union, although Scotland, during the vote several years ago, was actually significantly pro-Remain, and that's caused a lot of friction, let's say, in the politics there. We'll talk about some of that a little bit later. There is an independence movement and has been for quite some time in Scotland, but it's not really terribly strong. And a number of the efforts that they have had to move towards complete independence from the UK have not really gone anywhere. We'll see if that happens again sometime in the next few years. We'll talk more about some of the governance later. But I do just want to point out, again, just for looking at the map, Edinburgh and Glasgow are actually quite close to each other. They're only about an hour and a half apart by train. um, in the lowlands, right in the middle of the country. And we're going to start with Edinburgh on the east coast, which is near the mouth of the Forth River, which widens as it gets over here into the ocean. And I should also point out Leith, which is the original historic port. And actually, even today, it's the current port as well for the city. The historic city is actually about 3 miles or so from the coast. I also just want to point out a couple things we're going to see later. Over here, we're going to visit the Forth Bridge, which is a very famous historic monument from the 19th century. And we're also going to go, it's not actually marked on the map, but we're going to go visit Rosslyn, which is just a few miles straight south from the center of Edinburgh a little bit later. You can see from an aerial view the large number of green spaces in the city. Holyrood Park is the largest one over here on the right, but there's also Calton Hill, which we'll visit, and the Meadows, a number of other parks throughout the city, which make it a very beautiful place to stroll around. I stayed in a hotel called the Royal Scots Club, which is actually a private club started after World War I to honor Scotsmen who died in World War I. But today it has an attached hotel that you can stay in, and you can enjoy, if you are staying in the hotel, you can enjoy a lot of the elegant public spaces that are part of this hotel. So there's some beautiful public rooms, including a lounge that you can have drinks in. There's a bar, a wonderful restaurant, very elegant dining room up on the first floor, where you can start every day, if you can stand it, with a full Scottish breakfast, which of course has eggs any style, tomatoes, toast, bacon. You can't see hidden under the bacon is blood pudding, sausages, all kinds of stuff. It's definitely a good way to start the day if you're gearing yourself up for a day of sightseeing. The arrival, which is the way I came into the city from the train, is often at the massive Waverley train station, which is the main central train station for Edinburgh. And above it is this luxurious Balmoral Hotel. And I just have to point out one interesting factoid about the hotel. You can see it has this beautiful tower. This is a hotel that was built in the Victorian era, late Victorian era, as a terminus hotel for the trains. But you can see it has a clock tower. And an interesting thing that I didn't find out until I had been there for a few days is that clock is actually, even today, deliberately set 5 minutes fast, so that if you are rushing to the train station to catch your train, it gives you a little added cushion so you don't miss your train. That's a tradition that they do even today. You can see the beautiful sunny weather I had, which is, as I mentioned earlier, very unusual compared to what Scotland normally sees, particularly in November. Here I am on the top of Calton Hill, which is about 350 feet high, and a very easy way to get a view of the city. We're looking west down Princes Street. You can see the hotel I just mentioned here by the train station, and way off in the distance, which we'll visit later, is Edinburgh Castle, probably the single most popular monument to visit in the city. And if you climb Calton Hill, there's a number of interesting monuments there, mostly from the 18th and 19th century. This is one in honor of Admiral Nelson. Here's another one, which is a Greek temple originally designed to mimic the Parthenon in Athens. And it's unfinished. It was built in the 1820s, originally to honor soldiers who had died in the Napoleonic Wars. And it was funded by donations, and embarrassingly, they ran out of donations. They didn't have enough of them. So it was never finished, and it's now considered this sort of unusual architectural folly at the top of the hill. And it's referred to sometimes as Scotland's folly or Edinburgh's disgrace, because they never ended up getting enough money to finish it. But it does make a wonderful spot to see all the way around the city. In fact, if we look to the south, to Arthur's Seat, which you'll hear more about shortly when we climb it, that's the highest point in the city. And it's kind of interesting that Edinburgh is considerably hillier than you might expect when you start walking around it. And there's a surprising amount of wild nature very close to the city, which is also kind of enjoyable. I'll show you that in a little bit. Looking towards the west again, over a monument to philosopher Dougal Stewart. And right behind it, this very weird looking building is actually a modern shopping mall. But it's kind of an interesting architectural thing right in the middle of the city. But Calton Hill is lovely because there's all these different monuments. It's very open. And if you're lucky, like I was, to get lovely weather, you can see views in 360 degrees over all the spires, church spires, hills, and so forth around the city, as well as the ocean, which is very close by. The building on the right here is the City Observatory, which was built in the 1700s. There's just another nice view over the city with all the spires. Edinburgh is very often considered one of the most beautiful cities in Europe because of its elegant layout and its architecture, which I hope you'll see as we go through some of these photographs. Here I am at the top of Arthur's Seat. This is the photo proving that I was actually there. Arthur's Seat is an ancient volcano, and it's over 800 feet high, which makes it an extremely high hill to have right pretty much in the center of the city. And it does have incredible views in all directions. It takes a good hour or so or more to climb. I took advantage of the beautiful weather to go up there. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to, because you never know what the weather is going to be like in Scotland. But here we're looking north back over the city to the Firth of Forth and the harbor of the port city of Leith, which is now basically just a port suburb of the city. And across the Forth, you can see the county of Fife. So despite the fact that Edinburgh is not actually on the ocean, it still feels very much like a port city because it's so close to all of the water. And this is looking back towards the castle over the most historic part of the old city. See the castle over here on the right. And also back to Calton Hill, where you can see the monuments that we were just looking at. The Arthur's Seat is actually part of what is called Holyrood Park, which is a very, very large wild park right in the middle of the city. The name of Arthur's Seat actually has nothing to do with King Arthur. It's probably, they say it's probably a corruption of an old Gaelic term meaning high place, which is very logical given the height of it. And you can now climb up along with hundreds of other people, particularly on a very nice day like the day I was there. But it's such a large park that you will have enough space to yourself, I think. But it's a fairly strenuous climb. And although there's some nice, part of it is paved, part of the path is just hard packed dirt. But as you get closer to the top, it gets much more rocky. So if you have any kind of mobility issues, you might want to think twice about it because it's reasonably strenuous. You can see how wild it is, though. It's funny. I have to show you something funny about this picture that you may not notice right away. This is looking up to Arthur's Seat, way up at the top. And I didn't realize as I was taking this photograph that there is actually, I accidentally caught a picture of this guy peeing in the shrubbery. So the poor guy doesn't realize that now he's part of a travel presentation being seen in America. One of the big buildings very close to Arthur's Seat and the park is this very modern structure at the base of the mountain called Dynamic Earth, which is kind of it's a science center and it has a planetarium, and it's a great spot if you're traveling with children. It's a nice diversion if the kids want something that's a little more interactive than some of the other kinds of museums that Edinburgh has to offer. But I think one of the best things for me, those of you who've been to my presentations before know that my background is in architectural history, so I'm always fascinated by architecture in the places I travel, and it's probably one of the most enjoyable things about Edinburgh. Here's a gorgeous hotel. There's a lot of beautiful Georgian architecture, wonderful streetscapes with elegant Georgian townhouses like you can see here. The Georgian period, of course, is related to King George, and it was kind of around the late 18th, early 19th century, and is very elegant, very symmetrical, usually. If you think about Bridgerton, if you've ever watched Bridgerton or thought about Jane Austen, that's the time period we're talking about, and a lot of the architecture is very appropriate for that era. There are some fancy official buildings like this one. But of course, Edinburgh being an extremely old city also has a lot of stuff like this. I love this building in the Old Town, which is at the very top of the Royal Mile. We'll see that in a minute. So I'm going to start you at probably, like I said, the best known of all of the sites to see in the city, which is the castle, Edinburgh Castle, which is on the top of another ancient volcano, just like Arthur's Seat. And there has been a castle on this hilltop since at least the 12th century, although much of what you're seeing here was built quite a bit later. I would recommend getting there early. You can buy your tickets because it's so popular. It's well worth it to buy your tickets online ahead of time. So you can buy a timed ticket and get there early. And I was lucky enough to get the first tickets of the day. Again, this was November, so there were plenty of visitors, but it wasn't as crowded as it would be during the summer months. And if you get there first thing in the morning, I actually had probably a good 30 to 45 minutes where the castle was almost empty before people really started to get in. And in addition to being a beautiful historic monument, you can explore all over the castle complex, but you see amazing views right in the center of the city. Here you can see the train station, the museums, the new town across the street, across the park rather, which we'll explore in a little bit. And way off in the distance, you can see Calton Hill, where we were just a little bit ago. The castle spans many centuries so that you can see elements from the medieval period and even earlier. The oldest part of the castle is a small chapel called St. Margaret's, which was built in the early 12th century and is considered the oldest building in the entire city. But there are also much more recent buildings like these 18th century buildings, which were built to house the governor of the castle at the time. And you can explore pretty much every nook and cranny of the castle complex, which is kind of nice. And there are a number of different museum installations that talk about the history of the castle, the history of the city. This building that looks like a church is actually not. It looks like it could be a medieval church, but it's actually the Scottish National War Memorial. And it's not old. It was built in the 1920s. And inside it is, as it sounds, a war memorial to mainly to people who at that point who died in World War I, along with earlier conflicts as well. You can also explore the historic castle, which has a number of period rooms that have been beautifully restored. So you can see a lot of the interior spaces, including the 16th century Great Hall, which you can see here, and also the Scottish crown jewels, which if you've seen the crown jewels in London, they don't quite compare to that, but they're still pretty darn impressive. And I was lucky enough to be there first thing in the morning, so there was no line. I just walked in and saw them. Here's another great view looking east towards the North Sea. Again, you can see the county of Fife way off in the distance. and Princes Street, which is the main commercial street, um, and separates the old city from the new city. And over here is the main train station. Because the castle is built on such a high rock, about maybe 450 feet high, it was an obvious place to put a fortress and a royal house. And this is actually the backside, and you can see just how well protected it is. And it's kind of unusual to have something like this right smack in the middle of a European city. But there's a reason for why the city developed this way. And I wanted to show you this historic map just to give you a little bit of background. This is from the time of Queens Elizabeth of England and Mary, Queen of Scots, roughly, showing the development of the old city. Here's the castle over in the west, way up on its hill. And this long road that goes down to the east is now called, it still exists, and it's now called the Royal Mile, and is another one of the most popular sites, attractions to visit in the city. But you can see the development of the original city all along this spine. The Royal Mile is actually built kind of along a ridge, and on either side, the hillside slopes down from either side of that street. There was a small lock in the middle here, separating what was the original old city from what was later developed across the loch as the new city. It was since filled in, and actually the loch, which you'll see in a little bit, is now one of Edinburgh's main public parks. And it's where the train lines come into Waverley Station. This is a church I just happened to stumble across called Greyfriars Church, with its beautiful graveyard. It was closed while I was there, so I didn't get to see the interior, but it has a beautiful churchyard. Another one of the main sites to see is Holyrood Palace, which is at the opposite end. If you go all the way down the Royal Mile towards the east, you will come to Holyrood Palace. And that was built starting in about the 1500s with James IV and James I. They moved the royal residence at that point from the castle down here, hiding in the back. On the right, I'm sorry, on the left rather, is the oldest part of the castle, and behind it, I'll show you something. Show you this a little bit closer up in a minute. This is Holyrood Abbey, which is now ruined. But you can tour the entire complex. The fountain in the center courtyard is actually from the 19th century. It's not as old as it looks. And here's a closer up view of the very oldest part of the palace. It even has a little doorbell, which I thought was kind of funny for a palace of this size. It makes it seem like you could just stop in for the afternoon and see the Queen and see if she's in by ringing the bell. It's built around this beautiful courtyard in Georgian style, and it is still used today for official functions, obviously. Here is the Abbey, ruined partly because of damage in the 16th century from invading English armies, and also the Scottish Reformation. But also partly because, unfortunately, just because of subsequent neglect, it was never really restored. So now they're just kind of trying to shore it up so that it doesn't suffer any additional damage. The roof fell in the 1760s, and since then it's basically just been a very picturesque ruin. And you can see behind it the remains of the larger foundations back when the Abbey was even bigger than it is today. Holyrood Abbey backs up to Holyrood Park, which is where Arthur's Seat is. But before you get to the hillside, there's a lot of beautiful open space and beautiful lawns where you can picnic and stroll along. There's some ponds and so forth. It's a beautiful area. And for something completely different, right across the street from Holyrood Palace, hundreds of years old, is Scotland's extremely modern Parliament building, with at the time, a pro-Israel demonstration. This was only a month after the terrorist attacks in Israel in October. So on varying days, there were either pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli protests and marches going on throughout the city. This building is extremely modern. It was very much criticized, as you might imagine, for being out of step with the style of historic Edinburgh. But it's actually become kind of, if not a beloved monument, it's certainly people have warmed to it a little bit. And it is actually a fascinating building, particularly inside. Scotland's Parliament, just a little bit of history here. Scotland's Parliament was merged with England's in 1707 when it became the United Kingdom of England and Scotland. But in 1998, legislation allowed Scotland, through something they called devolution, powers were devolved to Scotland's Parliament. So there are a certain number of things that Scotland can now do for itself. Essentially, they can decide things that are not expressly considered to be part of the purview of the UK Parliament based in London. I just happened to notice in the chat that there's a question about whether those are supposed to look like guns on the outside of the Parliament building. And now that you mentioned it, I can kind of see that, but no, they are not. The designs are mostly abstract, from what I was able to understand. You can take a tour of the inside of the building if you want, where they talk a little bit about the architecture. But it's a very unusual building, as you can see. It opened in 2004. And it's kind of hard to get a grasp of because there's so many little different parts that bump up against each other. This is the inside, the main chamber for Scotland's Parliament, which has 129 MPs. It is a unicameral parliament, so it's just this one legislative body. And as long as there's nothing going on, you can tour most of the building on your own, or if you want, you can. They have organized tours that will explain a little bit more. This is the backside. Again, you can see just how completely unusual this building is compared to the rest of the historic city. There was a vote in 2014 to see if Scotland wanted to pursue independence, and it garnered only 44% at the time. But there's still very strong interest in splitting from the rest of the UK, especially since Brexit, which even in the rest of the UK, people are, recent polls seem to indicate people are having some misgivings about. The Scots actually opposed Brexit by a fairly substantial margin. So there's always been this friction where they were essentially forced out of the European Union by the vote that came from the other parts of the UK. Again, just some more pictures of the building from different angles. But certainly one of the delights of Edinburgh is just strolling different neighborhoods. This was just a random modern artwork I happened to stumble upon that I thought was kind of fun. But probably the most famous street in the city, as I mentioned, is the Royal Mile, which runs from Holyrood, where we just were, straight up the hill to the castle through the old town of the city. And it was so called the Royal Mile because originally it was the royal processional route between the castle and the palace. And technically, it's a smidge longer than an English mile. It's one Scottish mile long, which is just a few, maybe like 100 yards longer than an English mile. And you can walk it in either direction, depending on where you feel like starting. It's very touristy, I have to say that. It's, but nonetheless, it's probably one of the more beautiful public thoroughfares in Europe. Very elegant, very historic. Most of the buildings on it are historic and in excellent preservation. Parts of it have been pedestrianized, but it's just a beautiful place to stroll. You can see lots of touristy things like delicious hog roasts if you want, or bunny wee gifts, and plenty of schlocky tourist stuff that you can buy. All sorts of things: sweatshirts, t-shirts, cows. This is a plague. If you're into rubber ducks, you can get one that looks like the plague doctor from the Middle Ages. All kinds of rude or humorous cheesy fridge magnets and other things having to do with kilts and men in kilts. But nonetheless, it's a gorgeous street, well worth strolling and stopping for lunch or coffee or whatever along the way. If you're into whiskey, I'm not actually much of a whiskey drinker, but if you are, whiskey obviously is very big in Scotland, as it is elsewhere in Britain and in Ireland. And you can taste, you can do tastings, you can buy. This is a store that had all kinds of different ones to choose from, all different price ranges and with different flavor styles, I guess. And you can taste often many of these places to compare the different ones. If you have any Scottish connections in your family, which I know many people, certainly in the Northeast here, do, should you happen to need a kilt, there are also a number of places where you can get one made for you. The Old Town, as I mentioned, this main street that goes up through the Old Town is built on this long ridge, kind of like a spine. And on either side are a number of very old narrow streets called closes. Flesh Market Close is one that you can imagine what in historic times, probably what that referred to. This would have been an area where there were unlikely either brothels or possibly meat markets, because flesh is related to the old word for Fleisch, meaning meat. I'm not actually sure which. But most of the closes that went, these narrow streets that went off the Royal Mile, were named for either trades or prominent merchants or residents that were somehow connected with the street. And there is one that you can tour, which I highly recommend. It's called Mary King's Close. It's actually only one of two that is named for a woman. She was, actually, it's four closes right next to each other. She was a major merchant, fairly wealthy merchant, unusual in her day for being a woman. And there were four parallel closes. This is a model where you can see from the main street these narrow little roads that went down in between the buildings spilling down the side of the hillside. And in the 18th century, the government decided to build the Royal Exchange on top of this. So they leveled a number of the buildings on top and just built the Royal Exchange, stock exchange essentially, over the buildings that were already there. So although from the street, what you see is a gorgeous 18th century, beautiful government building, underneath it are still the original buildings that have been now covered over. So they are no longer open to the sky as they would have been originally, but you can take a tour, and it's the tour guides are excellent. I was really amazed at how good a job they did and how much they knew, so that you can get a bit of an idea of what old Scotland or old Edinburgh would have been like to live in during the 17th, early 18th century. Right across the street is probably the most famous building along the route, which is St. Giles Cathedral, also very old, back to the 14th century. And it was converted to the Church of Scotland in the mid-1500s when the Scottish Reformation occurred. and there was the split from Catholicism. Right behind it is a monument to Adam Smith, the famous 18th century economist and philosopher. I should mention a little bit about religion since we're talking about the cathedral. Nowadays, Scotland is pretty diverse religiously. About a third of the population is Church of Scotland. About 15% are still Roman Catholic, and another third or so, at least according to surveys, describe themselves as non-religious. And the remaining small amount is the usual mix of others, especially from Asian religions, from immigrants, which there are quite a few of in Scotland, particularly in the cities. The interior of the cathedral is beautiful Gothic with gorgeous stained glass, and this spectacular chapel off to the side, which you might think was from the Middle Ages, but it's actually not. This is called the Thistle Chapel for the chivalric order of the Knights of the Thistle. And believe it or not, this was actually constructed in the beginning of the 20th century. So this is barely 100 years old, even though it looks like it was something out of 1300. The detail is incredible, particularly on the ceiling. And here's the main nave of the cathedral, which is just glorious, with the blue spotlit vaulting at the top. In 2022, when Queen Elizabeth passed away, she lay in state here for a time as part of her funeral procession throughout the United Kingdom. And if you walk through the gardens, which I mentioned, these are called the Princes Street Gardens, which are in a sort of low area, which I mentioned was originally water. It was a loch, and it got filled in. Princes Street is on one side. That's where these photos were taken from. Princes Street is the main street in the new town. And Edinburgh is now divided kind of by this park in the middle into what was the earliest part of the city, and the new town, which new is a relative term, obviously, because new is really referring to the 18th century. So much more recent than the old town, but still. So Princes Street is the main thoroughfare in the new town, and it borders a number of important monuments, which I'll show you shortly, and it borders this park. Whereas the Royal Mile is the main street in the old town, and they are more or less parallel. If you walk along Princes Street or through the gardens, you get great views of the castle from down below. It's quite the Instagrammable spot. This is one of many dog statues throughout the city. Scotland loves its dogs. This one was one of the ones I hadn't heard of. This is called Bum. Bum was from the 1880s. He was beloved in his neighborhood. The most famous one, which I neglected to take a photograph of, is Greyfriars Bobby, who was a terrier who got very famous in the 19th century for guarding his master's grave for many years after he died. And there's actually a statue to him outside Greyfriars Church. Here's some of the monuments on this side of town. This astounding one on the left is a monument to the author Sir Walter Scott. It's over 200 feet high. And on the right is the towers of the new college, which is part of the University of Edinburgh. This is the Divinity School, actually. If you are anywhere in the UK, of course, you have to have fish and chips. And on the recommendation of a friend, I had to go to Bertie's, which is considered the best proper fish and chips in Edinburgh. And I have to admit, it was really good. I, of course, also had to have some sticky toffee pudding for dessert. And although I'm not much of a beer drinker myself, one thing I love about the UK is how easy it is to get a wide variety of ciders, which I do like. So that's what I tended to drink when I went to pubs. This is the street that that particular restaurant is on. It's this stylishly curved street called Victoria Terrace, named for the Queen, Victoria, and it has these great colorful buildings. And up above, you can kind of see this promenade, which is elevated, so you can actually walk along here and look down onto the street. And it gives a bit of an idea of just how hilly Edinburgh is. Not just the places, the big places like where the castle is or where Arthur's Seat is. The rest of the city has some pretty substantial hills in it. It's also a magical city at night. This is that same house that I showed you earlier at night. And they light up many of the monuments, like the castle itself, and just a lot of the beautiful little atmospheric streets that you can stroll around. Looking back down towards the new city, Princess Street is across the back. The two big buildings that you see in the foreground are the National Galleries of Scotland. I didn't have time to go to those, but they are supposed to be well worth the visit. Here's a close-up. And of course, the views of the castle, looking back up over the gardens. Because I was there in November, beginning of November, but nonetheless, Scotland was really big into Christmas, like, 2 months ahead of time. So even though it was the beginning of November, an incredible amount of Christmas decorations were all over the city. A lot of buildings were lit up with red spotlights. This used to be the Bank of Scotland. Now it's a swanky restaurant. And clearly they know how to decorate. Here's another streetscape of Edinburgh. There are a number of these crescents or circles, which are a very typical urban design element from the Georgian period. We're now in the new town, which is on the north side of the city. Lots of elegant Georgian townhouses in a row. You'll often see crescents like this, or what they call circuses, which is a complete circle. And usually in the middle, there will be a park, often a private park, which only the residents are allowed access to. And here's a very typical fancy Georgian entry. You'll often see a lot of very beautiful, bright painted doorways. And even the less fancy neighborhoods like this one still have beautiful rows of stone townhouses. And a popular place to live nowadays there are different names for these. They're often called mews. They're little back alleys. This one is actually behind one of the other crescents. And they were originally for carriages, stables for horses, servants' quarters, and so forth. But these days, many of them have been spiffed up and are extremely desirable and expensive housing, particularly because they're a little off the beaten path and they're quaint and have cobblestone streets and so forth. This is one of the nicer ones with its picturesque church steeple in the background. If you want a little more drama, here's the residence of the Prime Minister, which is on Charlotte Square. And just to the left, the doorway here is called Georgian House, appropriately, because it's a Georgian style house, and it is now a house museum, which, if you're interested in that time period or that style of architecture, it's a great place to visit. It's part of the National Trust now, and it's a private home that was built for a wealthy family in 1796. And you can tour it on your own, and they have a number of really good docents and tour guides throughout the building to answer all kinds of questions. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of the time period, if you've watched Bridgerton on TV or you're into Jane Austen, this is the kind of atmosphere that era would have evoked. Beautiful interiors from the late 19th and late 18th rather, and early 19th century for a well-to-do family. in an urban environment. And like many house museums of this type, they do a good job of not only showing you where the family would have lived, but also the below stairs part of the house. So you can see where the servants lived, where they cooked, where they did laundry, and how a house of this type would have been run, because it took quite a lot of effort to provide all the services necessary for that kind of family. Here's the wine cellar. And I loved this. You'll never guess what this funny thing is on the left. This is actually a piece of luggage, and it was specifically custom built to carry the silver, the family silver, if they traveled. So each one of these oddly shaped little compartments is for a piece of silver, a gravy boat, whatever it might be, so that they could transport the silver if they were going to London or somewhere else, or to a country house. They could take everything with them. Another really nice spot to visit that's not too far from the center is called Dean Village. Dean Village is very old as a neighborhood, and was once originally a very prosperous mill village that was actually outside the city, but over the centuries, particularly since the Industrial Revolution and more recent development, it's kind of been swallowed up and is now just a neighborhood of downtown Edinburgh. And today it is very chic, very upscale. But it's kind of a world unto itself. It has the river, which is called the Water of Leith, that runs through it, and that's what would have powered the 11 mills that used to be here. And many of the original buildings have now been turned into this one. Actually, this was called Well Court, was built in the 1880s as workers' housing, and now it's fancy apartments and public spaces and so forth. But you can also, from Dean Village, you can stroll along the waters of the Leith for quite a ways. There's a beautiful walkway kind of down in this glen that's very protected and forested. So it's a nice way to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. Along the way, there's some beautiful monuments and sculptures. This is called St. Bernard's Well, and is the site of a natural spring that was originally thought to have healing powers. And if you keep going, you will eventually, to the north of the city, end up in the Royal Botanical Gardens, which are quite old. They were founded in 1670 by the royal family. And they have a nice view back over the city from the hills, and lots of areas to stroll through. Trees, they have trees and shrubs and greenhouses showing plants from all over the world. And even though I was, again, there in early November, which is not the ideal time to see plants in Scotland, there was still quite a lot of beautiful greenery and fall foliage and so forth. So as a public park, it's beautiful. Plus it's free, which is also nice. So it makes a very restful oasis if you want to just explore a little bit and see some beautiful gardens. This actually is a glade of magnificent sequoias. And here I am enjoying, I'm pretending I was in Greece, even though I was in Scotland, because the weather was so nice. It was kind of hard to believe that I basically had 8 days of pleasant, warm, sunny weather, which is almost unheard of in Scotland. So I'm going to take you on a couple of quick side trips from Edinburgh also. This is to a few miles south of the center of the city is Rosslyn Chapel. There is a city bus if you want to go there, but it's a bit of a trek on the bus. So I just took an Uber because it was a little bit easier. Rosslyn Chapel is old, from the 15th century, and was originally founded as a Catholic church, and in the Reformation was changed. Now is a privately owned Scottish Episcopal church, and it is very famous for a couple of reasons, primarily for its mind-boggling stone carvings, both inside and outside. It's not a very large building, which makes it, I think, all the more striking, because it's kind of like a little jewel box of Gothic art. with all these incredible details. There have been, for a long time, stories of connections to the Knights Templar and the Holy Grail. There's really not much actual basis for any of those theories. And the church, unfortunately, had fallen into decline for quite a long time. But it was resurrected in the 20th century by a private family. And it got a big boost in the early 2000s because you probably remember, even if you didn't read the book, I'm sure you've heard of the Da Vinci Code, the book that Dan Brown wrote, which came out in 2003. And then not too long after, in 2006, they made a feature film out of it starring Tom Hanks. And so it became incredibly famous. And the book, there's a couple of very famous scenes at the end of the book that take place in Rosslyn Chapel. So even though most of the connection that the fictional story uses is entirely fictional, but it drew a huge amount of attention to the building. And now, since then, and even up till today, it attracts enormous numbers of visitors and, fortunately, enormous amounts of money, which has enabled them to do a lot of restoration. Here you can see the fantastic vaulted ceiling inside. There's some beautiful stained glass. And there are unbelievable numbers of individually designed little sculptures throughout the building that they will help you find that have weird characters and stories symbolic of different aspects of the history of the church or mythological creatures and so forth. It's just an amazing place to see. It's also in a beautiful location, a very quaint village out in the countryside. So if you want to escape the city just for a few hours, it's a nice getaway. Another one that I would recommend if you have a chance is to the Firth of Forth, which is only about 7 miles north of the city. The word Firth is distantly related to the Norse word fjord, meaning, well, what you can see here, a sort of narrow inlet of water. And this bridge is one of the more famous bridges in the world, actually. It's 1.5 miles long and now a UNESCO heritage site, finished in 1890. And it's a railroad bridge. It was the first bridge to cross the Forth, and it was designed to take trains across to replace ferries, which were less reliable, and is considered an engineering marvel and a symbol of Scotland. And there's a beautiful spot along the Firth where you can park, and there's a promenade along the river with places where you can get food and take photos and so forth. Again, getting there requires either having a car or rather slow public transit. But it goes through some beautiful countryside, and you can take an Uber if you want, like I did, which makes it a lot easier. But in addition to this bridge, you can also see the other 2 bridges that cross the Forth at this location, the Queens Ferry Crossing Bridge, which is in the middle. That's a cable-stayed bridge completed fairly recently in 2017, and also the earlier Forth Road Bridge from 1964. Both of those are for car traffic. I made a special point to walk 2 miles out of my way. This is what the traveling librarian does for you, so that I could see Scottish Highland Castle, known, and I can't really do a Scottish accent, but there they call them edgy goos, which they actually are. They are very hairy cows. They have shaggy coats, long horns, and are another popular symbol of Scotland. You can buy all kinds of plush ones in the tourist shops and so forth. But I was very excited that when I drove by with my Uber driver, we happened to see a couple of them. And so I made a mental note of where they were and hiked back to them on the way home. He has a convenient built-in back scratcher, as you can see. Back in the city at night, just a few more pictures of the gorgeous city decked out for Christmas, decorations and shopping. Here's the hotel over the train station. Even the weird modern shopping center gets lit up at night. Being a public librarian, I always have to go to the public library, which is here. But I also wanted to highlight probably if you're going to do one museum in the city, definitely do this one. It's one of the major attractions in all of Scotland, actually. It's two buildings in one, historic one and more recently built one, with the National Museum of Scotland. The older part of the building is mostly sciencey stuff, technology, natural history, that sort of thing. And then the new building attached to it, which was built much more recently, is focuses on art and the history of Scotland. And the collections are magnificent, as well as the building, even if you only go through it, make a quick pass through just to see the architecture. It really gives you a feel of that sort of old 19th century, old-fashioned type of museum, originally built in the 1860s. And it does have some very important things to see. Some of the most famous exhibits are, this is in the new part of the building, which was built in 2011. This is part of the set of Lewis chessmen. Some of them are in London, I believe, at the British Museum. And here's a number of them here. An old Celtic harp. In the science section, this is Dolly the sheep. Remember her? A lot of oddball things. This was the first cloned animal, along with all kinds of skeletons of dinosaurs, animals. It's a great place to take kids and grown-ups, but particularly kids, I think, would definitely enjoy the museum, particularly this part, although the historical part also is quite a spectacular place. And if you go to the top, there's a terrace that you can go all the way to the rooftop, where you can see the whole city from a slightly different perspective. Here we are in the back of the Royal Mile, so you see the castle and the big esplanade, and the Royal Mile goes behind these buildings here down to the right. Looking back over towards the cathedral. I also did some wandering through some neighborhoods. This was a fun place to stop. This is called Fettes College. Unfortunately, you can't visit it, so I had to take pictures through the fence. It's a private boarding school, a very exclusive one. And supposedly J.K. Rowling was inspired by the architecture when she was designing Hogwarts for the Harry Potter books in her mind. And it's certainly, you can see where that would come from. It's quite a spectacular place. A lot of very famous people have gone here, including Tony Blair, for example, actress Tilda Swinton. And from a fictional point of view, James Bond also went here before he went to Eton. And here's some kids playing footy with the castle off in the background. I loved this humorous sign, beware of children. Personally, I think that's always actually very good advice. And you can't go to any place in Scotland, certainly Edinburgh, without having pub meals. Here's a stylish pub decked out for Christmas where I had beef and Guinness pie, and another big glass of cider for my last night in Edinburgh. So we're going to move on now to Glasgow, which is slightly larger than Edinburgh, and in fact is the third largest city in all of the UK. And the River Clyde, which you can see here, flows west through it. So as opposed to the Forth, which goes in Edinburgh, is heading east, Glasgow, the river is heading west. And Glasgow is actually also a very old city, although it may not seem as much when you're walking through it. It's it's got a it's got a very different personality from Edinburgh, and I think it's kind of enjoyable to see the two together so that you can see how they are similar and how they are different. This is the train ride. It's very easily reached by train from one to the other. It's barely 40 miles or so. For those of you in Massachusetts, it's like going from Boston to Worcester. And so it's an inexpensive train ride and maybe 90 minutes at the most. You can see off in the distance, you can see the three bridges that we were looking at earlier that cross the Firth of Forth. And here's the train station when you arrive. Actually, this is Waverley in Edinburgh. Sorry about that. This is the train station, Glasgow Central Station, which is indeed central and very big. And I stayed in the big old gigantic hotel that was a Victorian hotel that was built over the station, just like the one in Edinburgh. It's been nicely renovated in recent years and has my room had a nice view over the train sheds. So it's an excellent central location and a lot of beautiful public rooms and very high ceilings. This was my bathroom, which the ceiling was, God, must have been 12 feet high. And again, the main staircase in the hotel goes up this huge tower. Glasgow was very fun for me again because of its architectural history, which is a little different from Edinburgh's. It has a lot of old stuff, it has a lot of medieval stuff, but it also has a lot of more recent stuff, which for me was very interesting, and I'm going to show you some of those. There's a lot of more Industrial Revolution era architecture. For architecture geeks like me, it's a terrific city to explore because there are so many buildings from different periods, including very modern things. This is only meaningful if you live in Wakefield, where I'm from, because we have an Albion Street, and I thought it was nice to see that Glasgow had one too, although to be perfectly honest, the one in Wakefield is nicer. But like Edinburgh, there's some nice Victorian era row housing, typical streetscapes like this. But some very important monuments as well. The cathedral is very old, 12th century, and it is in fact the oldest building in the city, dedicated to St. Mungo, who is the patron saint of Glasgow. He's buried in the crypt. This is the oldest part of the city where it originally was founded and started to grow. The inside of the cathedral is quite nice. Although I should show you on the right, this is actually an image of what the interior originally looked like when it was brightly painted, which it is no longer. This is the interior now, with a very different design scheme. But it's a beautiful Gothic cathedral, a lot of details, and a very nice museum in the basement. This odd little thing stuck off the side. For those of you who are fans of British comedy, you might have heard of Blackadder. And there was actually an actual real Blackadder. The fictional character played by Rowan Atkinson in the comedy series. There really was an actual Blackadder, and he lived from the late 1400s to the early 1500s. And he was one of the last great builders at Glasgow, and he was one of the archbishops, one of the very first archbishops as well. And this is called the Blackadder Isle, which is a little thing that got stuck onto the side of the cathedral. Behind the cathedral is this hill called the Necropolis, which is a very pleasant garden cemetery with very nice views. Beautiful place to kind of stroll around. Again, I was lucky with the weather. And it's reached by crossing what's called the Bridge of Sighs to the world of the dead on the opposite side. And unless you're obsessed with Scottish history, I wouldn't say there's a lot of really famous people buried there, but there are certainly some very beautiful tombs like these, and it's very atmospheric, and of course has an amazing view This is looking south towards the river, some of the industrial areas of the city, and back towards the cathedral and the bridge. Very close to the cathedral is this building that looks ancient, but it actually isn't. This building was built in the 1980s, believe it or not, but it is built in what they call the Scottish baronial style. And it's a museum named after Saint Mungo, the patron saint, and it is dedicated to religion, world religions, not just religion in the UK, but religions across the world and the art that represents them. Another big monument in the center of Glasgow is the City Chambers, what we would call City Hall, which dominates George's Square, the main central plaza. You can take tours of this building, and even if you don't take a tour, it's worth it to stick your head in just to see the extravagantly decorative and apparently very expensive when it was built interior decorations that have marble and mosaics and murals and elegant fancy lighting fixtures and this massive marble staircase, which has actually been used in a number of films as a stand-in for the Vatican in Rome. When they have to do films, they use this as a stage set because you could easily see this being part of the Vatican. I unfortunately didn't get lucky on the timing to take one of the free tours through the building, but as I said, you can still wander around a good part of it on your own. It's also a very beautiful building at night if you have a chance to wander around in the evening. Glasgow has probably more than Edinburgh. I think Glasgow is a mix of old and modern. So here you can see some very modern buildings, some commercial buildings from the early 20th and 19th centuries, and a subway. Edinburgh does not have a subway, I should point out, although they have pretty good public transit. It's mostly buses and trams, whereas in Glasgow, there is a pretty good circular subway system that it's not ideal for tourists because it tends to, many of the places it goes are probably more useful for residents, but it's not terribly expensive. And so if you're trying to avoid a lot of walking, it is a good way to get around. Here's another few examples of the variety of buildings around the city. It has much more of a grid pattern than Edinburgh does. And again, the incredible variety of buildings. There's Victorian on the left and this amazing Art Deco thing called the Beresford, which was built in the 1930s as a hotel. And now it's been converted into very upscale residences. Another commercial building in the downtown area. And I was impressed at the public toilets. Even the public toilets are architecturally quite impressive. Here's some more Victorian era buildings. A lot of the ones that you'll see in Glasgow are sandstone or brownstone. Like you can see here, they're very warm red color. This is the Britannica Panopticon, which is a music hall. It's considered the world's oldest music hall from 1857, and they still have performances, which you can see. They do mention, though, I didn't get a chance to go inside and see a performance, but they do point out that when you book tickets, the building, even to this day, is not heated. So if you go at certain times of year, you should be aware of that and dress accordingly. Here's another of the big old public buildings, or this could very well have been a bank, decked out for Christmas. And some others. This one on the left, I was kind of disappointed. This is one of the most beautiful old mansions. It's called the Charing Cross Mansions, which were built originally as very elegant housing. in the Victorian time period, and they've been beautifully restored, except unfortunately they have a Burger King on the first floor, on the ground floor. And on the right is a Georgian style building that looks like a church, but it's actually called Hutchinson's Hall, and it was built as a hospital, which it is no longer. It's now a fancy restaurant, like many other things in Glasgow. Another fancy hotel decked out for Christmas. This building I found amazing, whether you looked at it night or day. And it's completely covered with these incredible wrought iron decorations. And this is on Buchanan Street, which is the major shopping street in Glasgow, and it's almost entirely pedestrianized, which is terrific. You can stroll for block after block, and there's musicians performing and all kinds of things to eat and places to stay, entertainment. It's a wonderful public space. This unusual building is a Sikh temple, catering to the immigrants who practice the Sikh religion. And for those of you who are fans of Doctor Who, I came across a number of full-size TARDISes randomly placed around the city. Another thing that Glasgow is famous for in more recent years, they started this about maybe 15 years ago. It was a project to revitalize a lot of sort of dumpy buildings by using street art. And there are now dozens of these murals across the city. And you can either stumble upon them randomly, which is not hard to do because there are so many, or if you want, there is an actual trail where you can actually do a walking tour so that you manage to see all of them strolling across the city. But there's quite a few, and they're huge. These are not little tiny murals around, like, you know, on the side of a small building. There, most of them are 3-4 stories high and incredibly detailed and all different styles. Another of the major attractions in Glasgow is lovely Kelvingrove Park, which is 85 acres on the west side. I got up early and strolled around in the fog. There's beautiful paths for cycling and walking, lots of monuments. The one on the left is Lord Kelvin, who the park is named after. He was a physicist. You may have heard of the Kelvin temperature scale. That's the guy it's named after. And on the right is Joseph Lister. I don't know why there was a cone on his head. I assume it was just a prank. He was a famous chemist who studied antiseptics, hence Listerine, which you might have used to freshen your breath. But the highlight in the park is the monstrous Kelvingrove Museum, which, like many of the other places that we've seen, is completely free. And it's an unbelievable building. The sun came out after a couple of hours of my strolling around the park. The current building is from 1901. The museum actually started earlier than that, but they moved into this facility in 1901, and the building is just mind-blowing. One side of it, like the museum in Edinburgh, one side of it is devoted to art and history, and the other is devoted to the sciences. And in between is this fantastic lobby, which you can kind of get a sense of the scale from these little people down at the bottom. And they also have this massive organ, pipe organ, which, if you're lucky, you may be able to catch an organ recital. They have those periodically throughout the week. And so here's the hall, the main hall on the science side of the building. And again, on the opposite side, they have arts and history. It's definitely one of the most dramatic sites in all of Glasgow. 20 years ago, they did a major refurbishment, so it's even nicer now. Note in the background, this little tower here. I'm going to show you that in a second. Just across the street from the museum is the equally huge Kelvin Hall, which complements the museum that was built a little bit later, and it's mostly an exhibition space for temporary shows. And then kind of behind that tower that I referred to is part of the University of Glasgow. So it's not even a maybe 5-10 minute walk away from the Kelvin Grove. And it's called the Hunterian Museum, part of the university complex. And it's another great place to explore, not just for the collections, but also for the beautiful architecture, which is certainly reminiscent of, if you've been to Oxford or Cambridge in England, you really feel almost like you're stepping into a set for Harry Potter. Hunter, who the museum is named after, was an 18th century scientist, and he donated his collections to start what is actually the oldest museum in all of Scotland. So it takes up part of this university complex that surrounds the medieval cloister. That's the tower that you could see a little bit before. And the collection includes things, it's kind of a mishmash. It has furniture and scientific instruments and fossils and anatomical specimens, all kinds of odd things. Here's the entry lit up for the holidays. And there's 2 courtyards. This is the opposite courtyard where you can see the chapel for the university as well. And you're probably getting a sense of what a lot of these museums look like on the inside. They're very 19th century in style. This one almost looks a little bit more medieval, with grand galleries and balconies with all kinds of fascinating exhibits, and a monumental grand staircase. The area around the university is quite nice. And because of the university, it's getting a little bit more upscale because there's so many students to support the businesses. This tiny little alley called Ashton Lane used to be nothing terribly special, and now it's become a really trendy place with bars and pubs and music venues and so forth. There's even a Scots Gaelic school in that area. And I should mention a little bit about the language because it has declined significantly, as you might guess, especially since it was actively suppressed in Scotland over the last 150 years due to various politics. These days in Scotland, only about 1% of the total population can fluently speak Scots. They pronounce it Gaelic, actually, as opposed to Irish Gaelic. And most of those people live way out in the Western Islands, the Hebrides. There's been a bit of a revival and some attempts to keep it from dying out completely, but it's hard to imagine that those efforts are going to be enough to really resurrect it. Certainly not to the level that Irish Gaelic is spoken in Ireland. As in Edinburgh, Glasgow also has a botanical garden, which is nice. Again, even in the fall, it was very nice for a stroll, especially since they have these beautiful Victorian greenhouses where you can go in and get warm, enjoy the tropical air, see some interesting plants from around the world. But I have to talk, before we close the program, I can't do Glasgow without talking about some local architecture that is specific to Glasgow. And some of you may have heard about Charles Rennie Mackintosh, who is a Scottish, both an architect and a designer. He was born in 1868, died in 1928, and his famous Glasgow School of Art, which you can see here, was unfortunately very badly damaged by a fire in 2014. And they did some significant renovations, and unfortunately, it's hard to believe, but in 2018, it was damaged by a fire again. So now they are trying to come up with the funding. Mostly it's covered in scaffolding. You can see a lot of that down here. This part here is actually the building. This is a photograph pre-fire to show you kind of what it looks like. There are plans to restore it, but it will take a lot of time and a lot of money, unfortunately. But because it's so integral to the history of the city, it's likely to happen. You'll probably recognize a lot of Macintosh design, even if you aren't don't think you know it. If you've ever watched American Horror Story, the typeface that they use is Macintosh in style. He was a major figure in the British version of what we call the arts and crafts movement, which is similar to Art Nouveau and the Vienna Secession. And it had different names in different parts of the world. William Morris and Frank Lloyd Wright were contemporaries of this time period, uh, doing their own personal versions of this kind of style. The focus, regardless of where you happened to be, whether you were in Vienna or America or Scotland, is that it emphasized non-machine made designs. This was a sort of reaction to the Industrial Revolution and trying to go back to handmade designs. And also with influence from other countries like Japan. Frank Lloyd Wright was very influenced by Japan, and so was Macintosh. And most of the famous names like Macintosh and Wright and so forth designed not only the architecture, but also everything else that went with it. So the furniture, the accessories, the doorknobs, everything. And there are a number of places in Glasgow where you can see Macintosh buildings. This one here called the Lighthouse, unfortunately, it's down a narrow street, so it's hard to see the building from far off. It's named for the tower, you can see here, and was built in 1895 as a newspaper publishing house. Now it's a design center for the city. This is another one in a slightly different style with ceramic tile on the outside. Also a newspaper house. It was built for the Daily Record, the Glasgow Daily Record. If you go to the Kelvin Grove Museum, there's a whole section devoted to Macintosh design, where you can see examples of his furniture here, and some of the kinds of wallpaper designs that he would have done, glass designs, and so forth. If you're familiar with Frank Lloyd Wright, you can definitely see some comparisons. Even though they never really knew each other, but they had a lot of similar inspiration. So you can see that they were heading in similar directions. One of the best places to actually experience his style for real is a place called the Willow Tea Rooms, which were built by Macintosh in 1903 for a woman named Catherine Cranston, who ran a tea house. She was very active in the temperance movement. So she wanted to build a tea house, and she had Macintosh design the whole thing, top to bottom, and it has been beautifully renovated. So the interiors, the exterior facade, the interior, the furnishings, everything is Macintosh, and was restored recently. So you can go there for lunch, for dinner, for tea. The food's pretty good too. But the highlight is really to be able to enjoy the atmosphere of what his design style was meant to evoke. It's a beautiful place. And like I said, really good food. I trekked all the way to the south of the river to see another building, which unfortunately, again, these are not my photos. I'm showing you some photos of what the building looked like. This is the Scotland Street Museum, which was built the first decade of the 19th century as a museum school. And I was very anxious to see it. And unfortunately, it was completely covered with scaffolding. So the good news is the scaffolding is because they're trying to restore and renovate it and reopen it as, if not a school, probably more likely an exhibition space. The bad news for me is I wasn't able to see it except for this. But oh well, it's an excuse to go back to Glasgow at some point. And I also highly recommend just strolling along the river. Glasgow is very connected to its river. Edinburgh, of course, doesn't have a river and is pretty far from the water. So Glasgow has a kind of different relationship with the water. The Clyde has a promenade that goes not just through the city, but in fact goes for miles. You can walk all the way along the river, all the way to Loch Lomond, if you're so inclined. And you can start, as I did, in the east of the city at Glasgow Green, which is a lovely park. This building in that park is called the People's Palace, another sort of Victorian exhibition space. And there's monuments and fountains. This is the front of it. And there's an amazing building that fronts onto the park called the Templeton. This was from 1892, was originally, you'll never guess, it was a carpet factory of all things. And it's been restored and is now part of a mixed use complex. So it has offices and restaurants and shops and things like that. And because the Clyde has been so important to Glasgow, as you walk along it, you can see a lot of the history of the river with many different bridges. Even though Glasgow is quite a ways from the open ocean, it was a major seaport for both shipbuilding and trade. There's a number of bridges across it. Most of the sites in Glasgow are north of the river. But again, walking along it, I think, is a good way to get a bit of a history of a sense of the history of the city. And there's a lot of modern architecture that's more recently been built along the river. This is called the Tradeston pedestrian bridge. It's more commonly known as the Squiggly Bridge because it actually does squiggle. It isn't straight. It goes in a kind of weird little wiggle across the river, built in 2009. One big site to see, particularly if you have kids on the south side, is the Science Center from 2001, which has museum exhibits. They have an IMAX theater. And in the background, you can see the tower, which is the tallest thing in all of Glasgow, 400 feet high. Actually, I think it's the tallest thing in Scotland, if I'm not mistaken. It has a great view. Unfortunately, it's been closed temporarily. I don't know when they plan to reopen it, but supposedly you can go up and it actually rotates at the top. But the Science Center is huge, absolutely massive. So you could spend an entire day there with your kids. This is looking back up the river towards another bridge called the Clyde Arc. And the big cantilevered crane that you can see on the left there is one, it's left over from the 1930s and is really the only one left at this point. Most of the others have been torn down, but this one they deliberately left as a reminder of the city's industrial history along the river when this was a major shipbuilding area and also a major trade center. This unusual looking building is called the Armadillo locally, and it's an auditorium. Some people have drawn comparisons to the Sydney Opera House, but actually what it's really supposed to recall, according to the architect, is a number of ship hulls, because this was the area where Glasgow's shipbuilding industry was focused. Again, if you like whiskey, there are a number of places in Glasgow, just like elsewhere in Scotland, where you can taste it, buy it. The Clydeside Distillery, which you can see here, has been making whiskey for over 100 years. And you can take a tour of it and also taste it and purchase it if you want. And at the very end of the walk along the river is another great place for kids, a very recent building called the Riverside Museum from 2011, which focuses almost exclusively on transportation and technology. So it's the building itself was designed by Zaha Hadid. I don't know if you've heard of her. She's a very famous Iranian architect. She only has a couple of buildings in the US. Much of her best known work is elsewhere in Asia and Europe. And her design, she actually passed away a couple of years ago, but her firm still designs under her name and tends to build very sinuous forms. And this is a good example of that right along the river. And right next to it Old and new is the tall ship Glenlee from 1896, which was originally built as a cargo ship. And you can get on it and explore it top to bottom. And the inside of the museum, which is enormous, has displays of cars and trains and boats and ship models, tram cars. There's things that you can ride, all kinds of stuff for kids. It's got a history of virtually every form of transportation you can imagine. There are railroad cars, tram cars, subway cars. Anybody who likes tech stuff could spend easily a whole day in that museum. They are building yet another pedestrian bridge right next to this museum, which will make it easier to cross to the south side. And this is that bridge under construction. Eventually, it's going to pivot on that concrete pylon there, pivot 90 degrees to connect the two sides. Supposedly, they're going to finish that and open it later this year. And so I'll end the program here. We're just a smidge over time with a very typical Scottish image. Here's just an ordinary Scottish guy walking around with his dog and his kilt. You'll see a bunch of people with kilts, particularly in the really touristy areas because they work in the shops and stuff. But I was surprised to see several, I wouldn't say a lot, but more than a couple of just ordinary Scottish people walking around with their kilts and often with their dogs. So I will end my program there and stop my screen share. And then let's take a look at the remaining questions to see if I missed any.
So Jeff, we've got about 9 minutes for questions. And folks, let's give Jeff a big virtual round of applause. If you haven't already, let Jeff know in the chat how much you enjoyed tonight's program. And if you have any questions, get them in now. And we're doing a hard stop at 8:45.
Okay.
Back to you, Jeff.
Let me run through these questions quickly. Did I say that both Scotland and England are only approximately the size of Mass? No, Scotland is. England is not. England is bigger, both in population and if I said that, I'm sorry if I said something confusing. No, Scotland is in area and in population roughly Massachusetts-y. When was I in Scotland? I think I mentioned I was there beginning of November. I thought that Princes Street was the main street. Yes, I think I mentioned that. Princes Street is the main street, the main commercial drag for the new town of Edinburgh, whereas the Royal Mile is the main drag for the older part, the old city of Edinburgh. Have I eaten haggis? No, I don't feel the need to. I'm an adventurous eater, but I just don't see the need to eat haggis. They have vegetarian haggis, but that seems to kind of defeat the purpose. Were there ever any Scottish Jews? That is a very good question, and I don't know the answer, but I will look it up. And when Robert sends out his follow-up email, I'll see if I can find an answer for you. My guess is probably not very many, but I honestly don't know for sure. Is the Ferris wheel that appeared a permanent thing? A lot of cities now. London has its eye. Paris has its wheel. Everybody has a wheel now. And I don't know if the one in Edinburgh is a permanent fixture or not. It was pretty big, like bigger than your average Ferris wheel. So I'm guessing it's probably there as part of a permanent way of revitalizing that whole park district, but I'm not entirely sure. How much of my planning was done ahead? What camera did I use? Believe it or not, I do have a good camera that I like to use. This particular trip, I used my smartphone. Every single photo that you just saw was taken with my smartphone. And I'm kind of amazed at how smartphone cameras have improved dramatically. There's a lot of stuff that I still really feel I want my genuine camera for. But this trip, everything you saw was taken with my Samsung Galaxy. How much planning do I do ahead? I do lots of reading ahead, just because, not specifically to set an itinerary, but just to get an idea of what kinds of things I'm interested in. Um, and in this particular case, the only bookings that I did ahead were the 2 hotels I stayed in, just because it's nice to know that you have a place to stay once you get there. Do trains still cross the bridge? I believe the answer is yes. When were the walls painted white? I'm not sure which walls you're talking about. What about the history and location of the 2 cities make the architecture so different? The short and quick answer to that is that a lot of Glasgow's development was just more recent. They're both old cities, but a lot of the major development in Glasgow that I showed you tonight was more 18th, 19th century, whereas a significant amount of Edinburgh's architecture and city development was, and mainly because it was the capital. It was where royalty was. It was the seat of power. So it developed much earlier than Glasgow did, even though Glasgow's an old city, it just wasn't as big back then. So much of Glasgow's development occurred more recently. So that's why you see a lot of more industrial era stuff there. I don't see any single family homes. Is that because I was downtown or not enough land? That's definitely just because of where I was. Yes, downtown is both of the places where I showed you tonight were urban. So you see urban architecture. If you go out into the suburbs, there's a lot of detached, semi-detached houses and housing estates and things, but definitely more out in the suburbs, just like here. Let's see. Did Charles Rennie Macintosh design influence the original Apple computer? I doubt it, but who knows? Does Scotland Yard have anything to do with Scotland? Presumably yes, but I honestly don't know. That's another one I'll look up for you. I'm writing these down right now, so I don't forget. I will look them up and email Robert in the morning and tell him the answer.
And Jeff, there are several folks in the chat in the Q&A saying that Scotland does have a large Jewish population, particularly, let's see. Yeah. So, you know, you're a reference librarian, so do your own research, but
I would very much believe that that's true now. I don't know about historically.
I see. Yeah.
Yes, both Edinburgh and Glasgow have pretty significant immigrant populations of all kinds. I just don't know whether that is true historically.
Understood.
And I'll take a look and see. I'm curious myself now.
Yeah. Let's take 2 or 3 more minutes here. Yeah.
Yep. Someone says they were in Glasgow in the 80s and it was much more dark and forbidding. Yeah, that's what I've heard. A friend of mine who is Scottish and grew up in Edinburgh, but knew the area quite well. A lot of cleaning has been done. He saw my picture of the train station and was amazed that you could see through the windows. So I think definitely Glasgow has seen a major renaissance in the last, say, 20 years or so. There's a place called the Macintosh House. Yes, I think that was part of the school that was damaged in the fires. Did I have any trouble understanding the Scottish accent? It depended on the person. In a few cases, yes. Most of the time, no. It was a delightful accent, but there were a few people, yeah, I had no idea what they were saying to me. It was not a busy time for traveling. November is not high season in Scotland. I just got really, really lucky in the weather. What is the location? Oh, did they ever clean the outside of the buildings? Yeah, that just costs money. So when they renovate places, they certainly do that. Um, what is the location of the view behind the speaker? Oh, you mean my uh, I have a house in rural Greece, and that's it. Um, Cacti in Scotland. Yeah, I have heard that some Glaswegian accents are hard to understand. Yes, as I said, there were definitely quite a few that were hard. Most of the time, no. How long was I there? I was there for 8 days. I spent 4 days in Edinburgh and 3 days in Glasgow, which I think was a good amount of time to. I could have certainly spent longer, and I definitely want to go back and spend more time in the countryside. But if you really want to focus on the cities, I think that's a good amount of time to do that. The blue boxes that I showed you are from Doctor Who. Those are called TARDISes. Uh, Google Doctor Who. It's a famous science fiction, classic science fiction show, and you'll find out what those refer to. Do I recommend renting in the old part of Edinburgh? Are there trains to highlights? Yes and yes. I think you can, there's no shortage of places to stay. Guest houses, Airbnbs, full hotels. And transit is pretty good in Scotland, especially if you want to do day trips in the countryside. Places to swim in the ocean, probably, but I bet it's damn cold. Big Hill in Edinburgh. Again, the two big hills were, the highest hill is Arthur's Seat. Colton Hill is slightly lower, and then of course there's Castle Hill, which is the big bump that the castle was built on. Do they like Americans? Oh yeah, certainly never had any indication otherwise. Would I do a presentation on the Scottish Isles? Absolutely, if I ever get there. Somebody is again mentioning the dark buildings in Glasgow. Are they expensive? Yeah. Can we visit? Can we visit you in Greece? Oh, sure. Email me. Except we are in the middle of nowhere, so I'm not. We'll talk. The stone material is, it depends. They have all different kinds of material: granite, limestone, sandstone, brownstone, all different kinds. And finally, is April a good month to visit Scotland? The best times supposedly to visit are in the summer, because that's the time when you're most likely to get nice weather, but you never know. It's kind of a crapshoot. And as I said, I went in November expecting an entire week of cold and rain, and I got lucky. Who knows? So winter is cold, and it gets dark early, but I would think April would be not a bad time to go.
So on that note, folks, let's give Jeff another big virtual round of applause. He presented for 90 plus minutes. He answered nearly 40 questions. Tremendous job, Jeff. Folks, look for an email from me tomorrow, link to a feedback survey, link to this recording, and information about some other upcoming Armchair Travel virtual presentations. We've got like 5 or 6 coming up in the next 2 months. And as I said, I'll also be booking Jeff for March. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Robert also, I'll remind Robert when he emails you guys tomorrow to include my email. I'm always happy to take questions. If there's anything I didn't get to, or you have other questions, feel free to email me personally anytime, and I'm always happy to talk. So thank you for coming, and I hope to see you at the next show.
Folks, please don't stalk Jeff in Greece. Okay, let the man have his peace. Okay,
it would be hard to. I'm really in the middle of nowhere. If anybody managed to find me, they deserve it.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I hope everyone enjoyed their holidays. Look for that email tomorrow. Have a great night.
Good night.